Welcome and thank you for joining session 4 of Seyfarth's webinar series, How Social Impact and ESG Are Fueling the Transportation and Logistics Industry. All participants are in listen-only mode. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature located on the right side of your WebEx window. The presenters will do their best to get to everyone's questions. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down. It will not be repeated and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees in the days following the presentation. On the next slide is a legal disclaimer. And now I'd like to turn the program over to the co-lead of Seyfarth's Impact and ESG Group, Amina Majid.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for spending a bit of time with us. It's my pleasure to also introduce Rebecca Davis, who, before becoming an accomplished environmental counselor and litigator, she also had a career as an environmental consultant, a microbiologist, and a specialty insurance adjuster, so giving a very unique perspective to ESG. And Jennifer Kraft, a seasoned benefits partner who beautifully navigates many of the complexities in a pretty highly regulated area, and now that area has an immense amount of political ESG nuances to them. So in our brief time, I'm going to begin with some framing and grounding of the ESG space, a little maybe back to basics for some, maybe, just kind of reminders for others. Jennifer will focus on the S, and then Rebecca will focus on the E. So to set the shifting business paradigm, ESG, it came into focus with a fair degree of fervor in 2020, fueled by social justice movements and elevated levels of dialogue around climate. And those events raised questions around what is the purpose of the corporation, and even maybe debatable for some, but what's the current social license to operate? So then we experienced, of course, the breakdown of the whole global supply chain through COVID and the Ukrainian war, and frankly, and other geopolitical events, and we're actually still probably feeling the effects of it. So that backdrop really opened the door for the investment community to bring the ESG term into focus by pushing for more transparency around the ESG topics through an economic value lens. And because managing topics, these ESG topics, they affect the bottom line, particularly since the majority of a company's assets are intangible assets. So that moves the conversation from a nice to have, framed as corporate social responsibility or sustainability, to this business imperative pretty quickly. And we've seen that change in roles dedicated to ESG management, legal being asked to sort of guide strategy, and then an intense focus on the board. So trying to define it, this is one of the many challenges around ESG. The lack of a clear definition also sort of contributes to how the anti-ESG movement is being shaped. So, and that's expected. There's this tendency to have dialogue in the binary, that it's a shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism. So what we offer is that ESG, it's really adding another layer or shifting the perspective of how an organization drives value and creates a sustainable and resilient business. And it's requiring companies to look at their business strategy in a way that, one, recognizes the interdependence of their supply chain partners and who they want to partner with in a less transactional way, how they're managing their people as a critical asset, and taking into account how it's adapting to climate change, regardless of what your views are, and other environmental issues. So it's not, a single thing in any regard. It's not an area of law. But back to who the corporation is serving, we offer a less binary take, which Unilever's CEO had said regarding shareholder primacy. That really a company serves its shareholders as a consequence to serving its other stakeholders. So it's not about a checkbox exercise or a do-good business. So we have a pretty diverse audience today. I think we have public and private, we've got domestic and multinationals, and even where you may sit in the organization. We saw general counsels, risk management, operations, human resources, and that's pretty awesome because this is a space that requires you all to talk to each other in the organization. You know, there's a real need for cross-functionality. And on this slide, I want to offer two main takeaways. So at this juncture, I think it's fair to say each organization is navigating one or more of the drivers on the slide. You know, and the what and the how will vary, you know, in terms of not everyone is, for example, readying themselves to respond to the SEC climate disclosure rules. But I think the importance of them will certainly depend on where your organization sits in the value chain. But even if, and I think this is a critical takeaway, is that it highlights the interdependence on how one organization's sort of approach to ESG can really impact another organization's strategy or success. So for example, if you have a public company that's determined Scope 3 emissions are critical and material to their organization, that's going to bring in their supply chain partners, some of which are private. That's going to kind of have a trickle-down effect across the value chain. So how do you sift through all that with consistency? And that's my second takeaway for this slide, which is taking you to the center and taking you to a North Star. So, and that is the alignment between values, your commitments, and actions. You know, I spoke about you all talking to each other in your capacities, and that's true because there's an incredible need for coordination because the alignment and what you put out to the marketplace, the goals you set, et cetera, that's really the grounds for the organization, how they mitigate risk and opens up the door to opportunity. And I think once you have that grounding in the organization in terms of your purpose and your values, then it becomes a matter of organizing around it. So ESG is not a single thing, like we said. It's really a collection of topics. And we all know that organizations, they're really being asked to be more transparent. Not always out to the public, but again, across your supply chain as well. And that transparency could be in public statements, like I said, across the supply chain, your investors, ratings and rankings, or just voluntarily. And we've noticed that a lot of times people think of ESG as three distinct pillars, but I think, again, like partners in the supply chain, the topics themselves are interconnected and interdependent. So when thinking about what is ESG, what does it mean to my organization, how do I get my arms around it, you know, we do offer that governance is really the overlay and the key, and governance of the E and the S. And I think that's been a big shift in the business paradigm, if you will. And governance, by the way, it's more than just your structure, your policy, and your procedures. It can be both a strategy enabler as well as a driver of culture. And many of the topics under the E&S, they cultivate culture. They create culture as well as value. And, you know, a lot of litigation does rise out of poor culture. It also rises out of risky practices. So if the mindset shifts to approaching ESG as an enterprise-wide value proposition, then delivery of long-term sustainability and resiliency, then the E and S topics that are relevant and material to an organization, because not all of them are, those need to be identified. And we typically start with simply looking at the organization's current activities that fall under the E and S, and that includes areas where you know, are already subject to sort of minimum legal compliance, like anti-discrimination policies. And then starting to look for those areas of both alignment and misalignment, whether it's in disclosure, it's in operations, it's in your purpose. And that's the other kind of challenging part, you know, of ESG, because it does require to be effective, both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And that's where I think it takes us to a reminder of the board versus the management role. You know, the anti-ESG movement, it's been becoming quite vast and in its breadth and its activity, largely because of the lack of understanding of ESG and the lack of a definition. So there is certainly, not to be ignored, a legal debate around ESG investing. and that positions ESG as an ideology versus economics debate, or a values versus value debate. But that, we offer is separate and apart from the director's duty of care and loyalty or their caremark duties. The directors, they certainly have oversight of management as it relates to the delivery of value for shareholders, and that has to be assessed whether management is effectively managing risk, creating opportunity, and driving value for the organization. And as part of that oversight, ESG considerations can and do play a role. And we know, kind of sitting in where we sit, that the D&O insurance community is certainly bracing for boards to be challenged on this front, and we're already starting to see the litigation and are expecting it. So I'll turn it to Rebecca.
Good afternoon. Amina talked about fiduciary duties and governance, in other words, the what, and I want to talk very briefly about one of the reasons why ESG matters, that being the risk of litigation. But the public and private sector have started to focus on policies to satisfy stakeholder expectations, and regulators are now implementing new standards and requirements. And as a result of this, there really are a number of areas where we expect to see increased litigation, which means that directors and officers will need to better understand the risks and how to mitigate those risks. One of the areas where we really expect to see an increase in litigation is with the SEC. In 2022, we saw historical activity with respect to the agency in the introduction of 3 proposed rules. First, the SEC proposed the climate-related disclosure rule, which will require all organizations with SEC reporting obligations to disclose certain information about direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. And this is going to have a material impact on the transportation and logistics industry because reporting companies will need to track the emissions of their vendors, including in the supply chain. And there are 2 other proposals that, not as material, still have some direct and indirect implications. The second rule, the SEC proposed a rule requiring registered investment companies and advisors, and in some instances, even unregistered advisors, to disclose their ESG strategies in fund prospectuses, brochures, and annual reports. Third, there's a proposed rule designed to curtail greenwashing of fund names, which will require a fund to invest 80% of its assets into funds that are consistent with the actual fund name. In addition to aggressive rulemaking, it's notable that the SEC has already confirmed its intent to pursue increased enforcement activity as well. In fact, in 2022, after filing a complaint against a Brazilian mining company based on misleading social and environmental disclosures, the SEC announced that it will aggressively protect our markets from wrongdoers no matter where they are in the world. And so we anticipate that this is probably just the beginning with the SEC. Another area where we expect to see increased litigation is greenwashing. The FTC is working on its updated Green Guide, which was originally issued to help marketers make sure their claims regarding environmental benefits and carbon offsets were true and substantiated. The new update will likely include information on how to avoid unfair and deceptive practices, but these same updates may prove to be a basis for future claims. We anticipate more claims based on greenwashing, really, as both regulators and consumers focus more and more on false and inaccurate claims, and also with respect to marketing strategies that do not comply with these regulations. Another big area where we expect to see an increase in litigation is environmental as a whole. And again, this is going to have a material impact on the transportation and logistics industries. We will talk about environmental more in a subsequent section, but for now, EPA enforcement actions have already increased under the Biden-Harris administration. And the Biden-Harris administration is putting more and more money into clean energy initiatives, including renewable energies and EV programs to push the U.S. towards a net zero country. So the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act go a long way towards that goal. But as a result of that new funding, EPA now has a new ability to pursue cleanup objectives and polluters. And there's also going to be a new focus on environmental justice and equality, which could spawn a new tranche of litigation in the near term, quite frankly. And we're also going to see more litigation with respect to emerging contaminants, for example, PFASs, and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And then probably one of the more interesting areas where we may see some litigation is ERISA. First, in 2022, the Department of Labor announced a final rule that permits plan fiduciaries to consider climate change and other ESG factors when selecting retirement investments. Biden recently vetoed an attempt to nullify this rule. And they're still unsettled, really, is the question of whether, with respect to the Dobbs decision, employers who have agreed to pay the travel of employees to go to states where abortion is now legal or still legal could face or expose the employer to criminal action in certain states. And then finally, consumer and shareholder cases are also expected to rise, especially as ESG gains traction and the plaintiff's bar learns how to navigate these cases. As an example, we have already seen cases filed against companies based on alleged false promises of diversity and inclusion achievements and zero tolerance for sexual harassment. And we expect to see more, including actions filed as derivative actions and private actions based on common law theories. Many cases have been dismissed, and a recent case, Delaware case, has held that the board of McDonald's cannot be held liable for an alleged oversight duty breach in connection with the alleged scandals at that company involving sexual harassment allegations. Nevertheless, cases spawned from the Me Too movement did gain traction and attention, and we do expect the plaintiff's bar to continue with these cases. And in fact, the plaintiff's bar has forewarned that it is considering common law, again, fraud, and other legal theories for the next round of pleadings. And so that's just what we can expect, I think, from the litigation perspective as we move forward. And I will now turn this over to Jennifer Kraft to discuss our next session.
Thanks, Rebecca, and hello, everybody. So I'm talking about the S of ESG, which is social, and I love the slide that Amina showed with the umbrella, kind of the governance structure over that. And you've seen we've kind of structured the format of this webinar to start with that governance piece and kind of the big picture of ESG, and now we're going to talk about the S, and then we'll end with the E, environmental. But the S, social, is really interesting because it's both inward and outward facing. There's kind of I think people tend to think of it as kind of the outward, are you a good corporate citizen, are you doing good community work and good neighbors in your community? But there's also a very critical aspect of the internal, and the social is your employee workforce, and what does that look like? So the S is a really critical aspect of ESG. And the internal piece can be looking at things like board diversity and your human capital and workforce, equitable pay issues, health and safety issues, talent management, inclusion, equity and diversity issues, as well as human rights and labor standards. So there's a lot that can come into that aspect. The SEC actually started a new human capital management disclosure requirement for public companies in 2020 that required companies to include in their public filings some information about their human capital management. Notably, those requirements didn't give a lot of specifics about what needed to be included in these human capital management disclosures. So we were really interested to see what they would look like. So for the first round that came out of disclosures in 2021, we analyzed 100 public companies across 10 different industry sectors to look and see what types of things people were reporting, what they weren't reporting, what they look like. And then in 2022, we doubled that. We did 200, we reviewed 200 companies, again, in those same 10 different industry sectors to kind of compare and contrast and what we saw. So some big picture comments of reviewing those is that there has been an increase in references to board and senior management in this space in general. We're seeing a lot of board committees that are reviewing ESG or reviewing human capital management issues. Chief compliance officers and ESG officers are kind of coming into play. But the fact that this is kind of reaching that board level means that there's going to be increased interest in it. And as a side note, while these are kind of public company disclosure requirements, I think they are instructive as to what other companies in your industry are doing, whether they be, you know, public, even if you're not a public company. Private companies would be interested in this as well. So the board oversight was up. There was also an increase in references to safety. You know, that's still an important feature. As you can imagine, this disclosure requirement came out in 2021. There was lots of discussion of COVID and how employers were dealing with COVID and responding to that. But we're still seeing a lot of references to safety in general, and that is a good metric that companies can measure their progress and where they may have opportunities for improvement. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, continues to be very important. Nearly all of the human capital management disclosures we've reviewed included some reference to that. Now, the level of detail that they included varied, but we're seeing a lot of companies continue to look at those issues. Certainly, we were seeing demographics reported related to race and gender, but also related to veteran status, disability status, LGBTQ status, and some even put, you know, reported about the number of people with advanced degrees within their company, depending on the industry. So, you know, diversity is broadening what that means for any different within each individual company, and can really help bring diverse perspectives to a company, which is the point of being helpful to the businesses in general. And then these last two, recruiting and retention and bonus, this has been a big issue for employers in all industries, you know, dealing with the great resignation and now this trend of quiet quitting, and how to really get people engaged in what is often a hybrid work format. So we saw a lot of references to those types of efforts, including engagement surveys, career development internally, really trying to develop professional growth for people within the organization. Obviously, flexible hours, work from home programs were certainly important, as well as various types of benefits, including a real increase in wellness benefits, mental health, lifestyle coaches, kind of well-being speakers. So globally, that's kind of what we saw. And then we will dig in on the next slide to kind of the two areas that may be of particular interest to this group: transportation and then the technology. So the transportation sector, you know, because of transportation is using, you know, inherently is going to be using air and ground transport, so have heavier carbon emissions. There was more of an emphasis on kind of the unique operations in the transportation perspective, and a focus on workplace health and safety measures. So really looking at personal injury and occupational rates, what those types of things look like, and reporting on those, as well as environmental sustainability. Again, within the transportation genre in particular, we saw a good emphasis on internal training and really trying to look at creating lifelong careers for employees at every level. And because of that inherently national and global reach of transportation, we did see a lot of focus on gaining diversity in perspectives, backgrounds, and experience. So that diversity piece was key, as well as technological innovation, like really looking at ways to facilitate transportation with less waste and greater efficiency. The technology and telecommunications industries, we saw a lot of, again, references to specific boards and leadership committees or key executives that were often named as having responsibility for oversight of the company's human capital management. Again, benefits were very important with telecommuting and flexible work schedules, and employee stock purchase programs where employees are owners of the company, and that, you know, getting back to Amina's point about stakeholder, really getting that stakeholder engagement. If your workforce are actually owners of the company, that's going to influence that as well. The next slide just shows a bubble chart that's available from our human capital management charts, and these are available on our website. And I think the last slide, we have some references of how you could get a copy of our human capital management reports, both for 2021 and 2022. But as you can see, these are the industries we looked at and the types of issues that we were looking at to see, to kind of identify those trends. I'm going to turn it over back to Rebecca to talk through the environmental piece.
All right, and before we get to that, I have one of the most important parts of the presentation, which is the CLE code. The code is SS6527. That is SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 6527. Again, SS6527. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the E, the environmental piece, and I'm going to try to focus primarily on ESG related to issues in the transportation and logistics industry. However, a lot of these concepts really are universal. So from the environmental side, it's important to understand where this is all coming from. In addition to litigation, there are other considerations and pressures driving the E component of this movement. First, there are increased stakeholder demands. Most public companies provide some form of ESG-related reporting. 92% of the S&P 500 companies published a sustainability report in 2020, and that was up from 90% in 2019, and that's up from 78% in 2018. Also, overwhelmingly, the largest environmental concern is climate change. As a result, there is an increased demand for industries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This trumps concerns for water, wastewater, waste recycling, and waste treatment and disposal. The issue right now really is climate. Also, socially responsible investing is a key right now, and more individuals are looking at how companies are responding to environmental concerns, including climate and environmental justice. Second, more and more regulations are being implemented. We have already talked about the SEC rules, but EPA also has proposed new rules regarding more stringent standards, including as to new emerging chemicals and emissions. Also, states have implemented rules and regulations. For example, California already has an emission rule regarding disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions and payment of mitigation fees for exceedances. There's also really significant international pressure. As to climate concerns, Europe and the UK are frankly way ahead of the US on this front. And that's in part because of implementation of the UN Sustainable Goals, which includes 17 interlinked goals, many of which relate to climate, once again, climate, but also relate to other environmental and social issues, or environmental matters and social issues. The UN hopes to have the goals implemented by 2030, and the EU seeks to be carbon neutral by 2050 as part of its climate pledge. So perhaps not directly related to your business, these concerns are going to have at least indirect implications in the US. And now, once again, the US is part of the Paris Agreement, and that agreement covers climate change mitigation, adaptation, and even financing of greenhouse gas reducing initiatives. And then also under the European climate law, EU countries must cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. And so I can't stress enough, climate, climate, climate. It is a big deal right now with respect to the E. Also in the US, there are new grant opportunities which we have never seen before. First, we have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed. And similar to the existing European goals, the Biden-Harris administration seeks to see the US reach net zero carbon no later than 2050, just as Europe is trying to do. And in order to help that realization, the Infrastructure Act seeks to build a network of EV charging stations, upgrade existing power infrastructure, and even increase resilient impacts of climate change on the existing infrastructure. Second, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 was passed, and that promotes, through funding and tax incentives, a number of projects, including installation of renewable energy systems, clean energy infrastructure, innovative clean energy technology demonstration projects, energy efficiency upgrades, and other clean development programs. And the act amended also the Clean Air Act to create the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Can we go to the next slide, please? So specific to the transportation and logistics industry, right now, there really is a theme. And again, climate. First, we can expect to see more focus on decarbonization. There is in process the creation, again, of an EV charging station network. The federal government has pushed it, but even without that push, we were going to see it happen. I think the key difference is that the EV station or the EV system that's in progress now requires that there be no specific vendor or car company that can use the federal dollars for a specific EV type. Without the federal funding, perhaps smaller companies likely would have been forced out of the process, or at least would have been marginalized, but they can now be somewhat bigger players in the process. And now we're seeing something interesting because there's a potential for local governments to be bigger players because of federal funding and grant opportunities. We're also going to see more alternate energy vehicles put in use on the road and at warehouses. So not just out on the interstate, but we're going to see that more and more and more in warehouses. And there are going to be a number of battery companies and battery recycling companies that are going to receive funding, and that is pushing the production of electric cars and new technology. And then other alternate fuels we're seeing on the rise include natural gas and also hydrogen fuel cells. And those are being used more and more in warehouses. And again, there's the proposed SEC disclosure rule, which if passed, as we suspect it will be a key factor. Certain registrants, again, will need to disclose their scope 1 and 2 emissions. In other words, what they produce and what they use. And if the registrant has set a greenhouse gas emission target or goal for scope 3, those emissions will need to be reported. And this is going to have a huge impact on at least the trucking industry. And then in addition to the federal programs that we already mentioned, the National Electric Vehicle Initiatives will be a huge factor in coming years. And although beyond the scope of this presentation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act have some highly relevant DOT funding initiatives. And then finally, environmental justice is more and more in the spotlight. Both transporters and logistic companies will need to keep in mind how their actions from warehouse to receiver will impact lower income or marginalized communities from both a safety and a climate standpoint. And funding has increased for environmental justice projects. And given that these communities are often in industrial areas, more attention will be drawn to mitigating impact to these communities. And this is probably really the one area where climate will be a focus, but will not be the primary focus. And perhaps more water and any exposure to pollution will be the key point for environmental justice. And so we are close to our time limit here. I want to make sure we have time for some questions. So I'm going to stop here. But if you have any questions regarding the environmental piece, just feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about it with you. So any questions?
I think we're probably short on time, Rebecca. So if there are questions, we can try and address those offline. But I'll turn it back to Amina to close us out.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Certainly at the end of the presentation, we do have some resources for you. Thanks for letting us take a little extra time with you and for joining us. So thank you very much.